Scott, here we are, New South Wales, Bylong Valley, Tarwyn Park. And I think, what was it, 48 hours ago we were in the snow at Eagle.
Yes.
And so what do you think so far?
Well, my first impression is obviously it's amazingly green and fertile and no pivots, no diesel tanks, very similar landscape, actually a lot drier and almost in a way. I mean, there isn't the Colorado River running down through the center of this, and the biodiversity of plants and grasses and birds and everything. I mean, we're standing here next to a bale of hay that's probably left over, unused. And what Peter's done with just the contours that I can look around and see, there's almost we'd call it a wetlands back home, and it's really just a natural sequence of pastures that we call pastures. You call them?
Yeah, that's good enough. We can have them as pastures.
Yeah.
Grasslands, pastures. They're both.
Some of them are probably grasses that are 4, 5, 6 feet tall. And many pastures of very healthy grass in a very similar environment to what we have back in Colorado.
Peter, just if I may, can you tell us what it looked like when you came here 30, 40 years ago? What did it look like?
Well, this particular area was described as a sour swamp, sour marsh. That wasn't very big.
Is that word salt or sour? Sour from...
Sour, but because of salt.
Right.
They didn't understand. In fact, nobody had recognised the reason that it all failed was because they'd changed the water pattern and moved salt where it hadn't previously moved.
Right.
And so it just looked, if you had gone into an area where there was a sour salty marsh, that's what this looked like.
Right.
But the marsh areas were, 20 acres, and then there was just bare soil around it. And periodically there would be a flush of grass, And what I started to do was to just simply go, well, let's recycle, let's try and get the dominance of weeds, which there were burr, we call them the guru burr. They were up to 4 meters high. And when I first looked at it, I had a suit on and I rode around on the back of a tractor and just about destroyed the suit and just going through muddy, sloppy, weed infested landscape. And so within really 12 months we gave it an opportunity to grow everything that was there for 12 months. And then we mulched it down, and that paddock has been like that for 35 years, since 90. That one over the back, yeah, that was the first paddock I did. It was the one that was the sour swamp, and we let it grow everything. And within a year it came up with grass such as is there, not all over. There were still patches that were growing, developing. And within the next 3 to 5 years it got to that stage. And now I understand enough about how you have to keep something feeding the system. And so it's been able to be maintained. My son has had little knowledge of how it used to work. Took him probably 3 or 4 years, even though I had to reconstruct a couple of things, but fundamentally he'd been able to manage it. So the resilience is there. You don't have to know what you're doing to get it to work. That's what that proved.
What gets me is while we're watching this coal train come through is, last time I was on the Colorado River Ranch, I was watching the train come through there.
Watching the coal train come through.
Through there. So there's it's quite an astounding similarity. Even if we look at this escarpment up here with the trees on it, Peter, the significance of those trees on that headland to what you're doing here. What relationship do those trees on that escarpment there have to what else you've done?
Well, always there is a coarse vegetation feeding areas of grassland. They will not live on their own. If there's just a grassland on a ridge, it is going to die. It's only a matter of how much reserve was there previously, because grass was not a plant that established a planet. It were these coarser plants and these weed plants. So as soon as you've got just grass, you can guarantee it can't last. Or you can't produce. If you use grass, then it's not sufficient to sustain the same fertility. You know, there are losses, there are oxidation, there are erosive losses, and so grass chewed by cattle, put back on the ground, there are still losses.
Well, it's just
If
it's a monoculture in itself.
Absolutely, but even with all of that in consideration, the mere fact that the green area on grass over time and space is insufficient to overcome the erosive process in the landscape and the cattle grazing it. Needs these dynamic plants. See, these plants here will multiply their mass in 10 days from today if they...
So we're talking about these here.
These are guys, yeah. And that means that you can't get a grass that could do that. So their capacity to repair a landscape is 1,000 times greater than grass. And once you recycle, that becomes food for the grass, because what we're looking at here is 50% of their contribution. They got the same contribution going on in the soil, as you can see above the soil. And the way they work is they ever increase that green area, which ever increases their capacity to do that, and that then maintains the rehabilitation of landscapes.
So you visited the Colorado River Ranch, and you said to me and Scott Jones that it was there were some very viable contours and opportunities there.
Absolutely.
And
3/4 of this work is already done there. The thing
quarters, right? Because of the river being there, or from the natural?
From the river and the fact that you've got a contour system. It's not, I think it's a contour, but it's a drain that used to feed the property.
Yes.
By reorganising it to a contour and something that was absolutely flood-proof under all conditions, then you could sit off this sort of fertility because you can manage it.
Right. So specifically, we had that area, if you remember, that was under gated pipe. And we had spent, you know, a lot of money putting in that gated pipe and got nothing.
No.
So,
well, science and agriculture have learnt to mine soil reserves. When the mulch farmer or the farmer that was able to sustainably maintain a landscape had to grow those reserves. And if we don't decide that we have to do that, because as you grow the reserves, you get atmospheric fertility, you get transported fertility through birds and insects being stabilised into the structure of the plant, and then it can be slowly decomposed back into your next cycle. Without that orderly system, we are going to lose no matter what. If we just put on a water-soluble fertiliser or we reduce its water solubility, it's still not like when a plant has a root system and microbes around it, the plant itself feeds sugars to the microbes, they break down the material, and the plant controls the whole process. There's no losses in that process. Every other process has losses. And they're the simple things that we shouldn't have to argue about. You know, there are things that just because of commercial capacity to sell sort of contracts and weeds and so on, it's ignored. But it is as fundamental and as basic as the sun coming up tomorrow.
and clearly, you know, there's no pivots, there's no gun irrigation. You don't see that. I mean, that's...
Well, there's a difference, a big difference. You see, if you deal with water tables, and there's a particular way, and there's two completely conflicting processes that create this water table. One is cracks in the ground and a lateral movement from the cracks. This is sandy soil which has veins through it so the water can move through the soil. Now, once that happens and the water is under plants in the root systems, it doesn't evaporate. So immediately, and especially if it falls into a crack, it doesn't reduce the surface fertility, it leaves it intact. So the water's then filling underneath. So your surface fertility is sustained. The water then that the plant uses to photosynthesize is 100% efficient because it only draws up what it needs. When you use a pivot, less than 5% of that water actually creates photosynthesis. A lot of it's lost in the atmosphere, a lot more is lost in the surface layer of the soil before it gets to the roots, and it all does damage to your fertility. So there isn't an example in the world where that form of agriculture has been able to be maintained for longer than much more than 100, 200, 250 years is about the limit. Because the evaporation rate and the salinity that gradually builds up in your water and therefore your landscape has destroyed every place. You know, if you get everything else right, the salinity, which is also in any artificial fertiliser you put on, which escalates the problem, is going to guarantee that it won't work.
It's interesting, you know, we were here about 5 weeks ago when before it started to rain. This was just brown, not here, but the guy up the road here, he is irrigating as we were watching, wasn't he? And it was, you know, it was like someone just spitting at, you know, a dusty bit of land, you know, and those irrigation pivots went on and on and on and on, and yet down here, no irrigation, and it looked very similar to this. It was still extremely green and healthy, and there was this sense of humidity and water, you know, around you, even if you couldn't see it all the time, was there. Whereas he was trying to apply it to the top, and it wasn't working. It was a perfect example of what Peter was saying, I think. You know, within, you could see it from here, so how it didn't work.
So there's never been any artificial fertilizers spray?
No.
Not in 25 years?
No. But, you know, you've got to recognise that there has to be a filtering system and there has to be a source. The source can be from the deeper soil, which is limited, or the source can be from a forest, such as we were asked the question, what's that forest doing? It's accumulating minerals. Some of those trees are 100 and odd years old, so for 100 years they've been accumulating minerals. Every leaf or piece of bark that it drops off has a representative of that accumulated mineral balance, and then the water moving through that is going to sustain a landscape. We can't go away from that, no matter where we do it. If we don't use those principles, it's going to fail.
That's certainly one of the differences between here and Colorado Marimba Ranch when you're looking at that escarpment off onto the north side of the river. I guess it's the north side. It's been denuded, and so it's just a series of gullies, really, except for a few spots. And then you can almost see where that green is, where those few spots are, where the trees are still there. And you know, is that something they'll need to consider when they're looking at what they're going to do with the ranch, Peter?
Oh, the most critical part that they should consider is that when there's a source of evaporated water, transpired water, there needs to be another area where that water can condense, or it just goes out of the system. If you can keep it cool enough and this grass is deep enough, then it can come off the plants, lose enough heat to sink back into the bottom of the plants and be reused. That is the most important water in every landscape. If it's not planned to use that landscape, it will fail everywhere in time.
Welcome to the end of summer.